For 15 years, she cleaned their floors, raised their children, and swallowed every insult. But on the night of March 15, 2019, when that final slap echoed through the mansion, everything changed. What happened next would expose a web of secrets so dark, it would destroy one of America's most respected families forever. This is the true story of Grace Washington, a 52-year-old domestic worker who endured years of systematic abuse in silence. For over a decade, she had been the invisible woman who kept the perfect facade of the Blackwood family intact. She ironed their designer clothes, prepared their gourmet meals, and suffered their cruelty behind closed doors. The wealthy Connecticut family appeared flawless to the outside world. Charity galas, society pages, and prestigious awards decorated their public image. But inside their $10 million estate, a different reality existed. One where racial slurs flew like daggers, where human dignity was crushed under designer heels, and where a woman's breaking point was treated as entertainment. Grace had 3 children to feed, college tuition to pay, and dreams that required her to stay silent. She convinced herself that enduring the humiliation was temporary, that her sacrifice would eventually lead to her family's prosperity. She was wrong. The Blackwood family had perfected the art of psychological torture. Victoria Blackwood, the matriarch of this respected dynasty, had spent years documenting her abuse of domestic workers, not out of guilt or self-reflection, but as a twisted form of entertainment. Security cameras weren't installed for protection, they were installed for pleasure. Every moment of Grace's humiliation was recorded, catalogued, and reviewed by a woman who found joy in breaking another human being's spirit. For 15 years, Grace Washington believed she had no choice but to endure. She believed that speaking up would cost her everything. She believed that her pain was the price of her children's future. But on that March evening in 2019, when Victoria Blackwood raised her hand for what she thought would be just another moment of dominance, she miscalculated. She didn't realize that even the strongest person has a limit. She didn't understand that 15 years of rage, humiliation, and systematic abuse creates a force that cannot be contained forever. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What drove a quiet woman to her breaking point? How did one night unravel decades of hidden abuse? And why are the police still looking for answers? Stay with me, because the truth behind that final slap will leave you questioning everything you think you know about justice. This isn't just a story about one woman's courage. This is about a system that protects the powerful while crushing the vulnerable. This is about the invisible workforce that keeps America's elite comfortable while suffering abuse that would shock you to your core. This is about the moment when silence becomes impossible and justice takes an unexpected form. The story you're about to hear will challenge everything you believe about right and wrong. It will make you question how we treat the people who work in our homes, raise our children, and know our most intimate secrets. Grace Washington never wanted to be a hero. She never wanted to be a symbol of resistance. She just wanted to go home to her grandchildren without another bruise, another insult, another piece of her soul chipped away. But sometimes heroes are created in the most unexpected moments. Sometimes justice comes from the most unlikely sources. And sometimes a single slap changes everything. This is the story of 2 women whose lives collided in the most devastating way possible. On one side stands Grace Washington, a 52-year-old domestic worker and mother of 3 who spent 15 years cleaning the same mansion, caring for the same family, and enduring abuse that would break most people. She arrived in Connecticut from Detroit in 2004 with nothing but hope and a determination to give her children opportunities she never had. Grace was known in her community as the woman who never complained, who worked harder than anyone else, and who somehow managed to smile even when her world was crumbling around her. She had calloused hands from years of scrubbing floors, tired eyes from sleepless nights worrying about college tuition, and a spirit that had been systematically crushed by the very people she served. Grace Washington was invisible to most of the world, just another face in the background of someone else's perfect life. On the other side stands Victoria Blackwood, a 45-year-old socialite who believed that money and status gave her the right to treat other human beings as less than human. Victoria came from old Connecticut money, the kind of wealth that spans generations and comes with a sense of entitlement that runs deeper than blood. She had never worked a real job, never struggled to pay bills, and never understood what it meant to depend on someone else for survival. To Victoria, domestic workers weren't people with families, dreams, and feelings. They were objects to be used, abused, and discarded when they no longer served her purposes. She was the face of charity galas and society magazines, praised for her philanthropic work, and admired for her perfect family image. But behind the designer clothes and carefully crafted public persona lived a woman whose greatest pleasure came from inflicting pain on those who couldn't fight back. The Blackwood estate served as the stage for this 15-year tragedy. Hidden behind iron gates and marble columns, this $10 million mansion housed secrets that would shock even the most cynical observer. Every room had witnessed Grace's humiliation. Every corner had absorbed her silent tears. The kitchen where she prepared gourmet meals while being called degrading names. The living room where she scrubbed wine stains while listening to racial slurs. The children's bedrooms where she tucked in kids who would grow up thinking it was normal to treat certain people as less than human. This wasn't just a house, it was a carefully constructed prison designed to break one woman's spirit while maintaining the perfect facade of American success. What really happened on the night of March 15, 2019? The official police report states that at approximately 9:47 p.m., officers responded to a domestic disturbance call at the Blackwood estate. When they arrived, they found Victoria Blackwood unconscious in the main living room and Grace Washington sitting calmly in the kitchen waiting for them. Grace made no attempt to flee, offered no resistance, and when asked what happened, she simply said, "I just wanted it to stop." But the truth about that night goes far deeper than a simple assault case. The truth involves 15 years of documented abuse, a security system installed not for protection but for entertainment, and a moment of reckoning that had been building for over a decade. Was it self-defense or something much more calculated? The evidence tells a complex story that challenges everything we think we know about victims and perpetrators. Grace Washington had endured years of systematic abuse, but on that March evening, something changed. Witnesses report that Grace seemed different in the weeks leading up to the incident. She was quieter than usual, more distant, almost as if she was preparing for something. Her sister later testified that Grace had called her 3 days before the incident, saying she couldn't take it anymore. But what exactly had Grace Washington planned, and how far was she willing to go to reclaim her dignity? The security footage should have provided clear answers, but instead it raised even more disturbing questions. The Blackwood mansion was equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance equipment, cameras in every room, recording devices that captured audio and video 24 hours a day. Victoria Blackwood claimed the system was installed for security purposes, but investigators discovered something much more troubling. The footage revealed that Victoria had been recording Grace's abuse not to protect herself but to watch it later. Hours of recorded humiliation, systematic psychological torture, and physical abuse that Victoria Blackwood reviewed like personal entertainment. But on the night of March 15th, several cameras mysteriously malfunctioned, leaving crucial moments unrecorded. But before we reveal what the cameras did capture, you need to understand how 15 years of humiliation led to 5 minutes that changed everything. Grace Washington's story doesn't begin with that final slap. It begins with a young mother's dream of giving her children a better life. It begins with a woman who believed that hard work and sacrifice would eventually pay off. It begins with small compromises that slowly became massive betrayals of her own dignity. Every insult she swallowed, every blow she absorbed, every moment of humiliation she endured was building towards something that none of them saw coming. The woman who cleaned their floors and raised their children was about to teach them a lesson about respect that would destroy their perfect world forever. Grace Washington was the kind of woman who believed hard work could overcome anything. She was wrong. In 2004, Grace packed everything she owned into a battered Honda Civic and drove from Detroit to Connecticut with her 3 children in the back seat and $200 in her wallet. She had heard about opportunities in wealthy Connecticut neighborhoods, places where domestic workers could earn enough to change their families' futures. Grace was 37 years old, recently divorced, and determined to give her children opportunities that poverty had stolen from her own childhood. Her oldest daughter, Maria, was 14 and dreaming of becoming a doctor. Her son, James, was 12 and brilliant with numbers. Her youngest, Angela, was only 8 but already showing signs of artistic talent that needed nurturing. Grace had worked as a housekeeper in Detroit for minimum wage, cleaning office buildings at night while her children slept. But Connecticut promised something different. The wealthy families in places like Greenwich and New Canaan paid their domestic help well enough to afford college tuition, well enough to break the cycle of poverty that had trapped Grace's family for generations. She found a small apartment in Stamford and began searching for work through agencies that specialized in placing domestic workers with affluent families. Grace had impeccable references, a gentle manner with children, and a work ethic that impressed everyone who met her. When the Blackwood family called for an interview in late 2004, Grace knew this could be the opportunity that changed everything. The interview at the Blackwood estate should have been Grace's first warning. Victoria Blackwood greeted her at the servants' entrance, not the front door, and immediately began questioning her about her immigration status, her criminal background, and her family situation in ways that felt more like an interrogation than a job interview. Victoria walked through the house, pointing out expensive items, mentioning their value, and making it clear that any damage would come out of Grace's wages. She explained that the Blackwood family valued discretion above all else, that what happened in their home stayed in their home, and that previous domestic workers had been fired for gossiping about family business. Grace needed the job too desperately to recognize these statements as threats. The Blackwood estate was everything Grace had imagined when she dreamed of working for a wealthy family. 10,000 square feet of marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The kitchen was larger than Grace's entire apartment, equipped with professional-grade appliances and enough space to prepare meals for dozens of guests. The master suite was bigger than most houses, complete with his and hers walk-in closets that resembled luxury boutiques. 8 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, a library, a formal dining room, multiple living areas, and grounds that stretched across 5 manicured acres. Grace would be responsible for maintaining all of it, ensuring that every surface gleamed and every detail met Victoria Blackwood's exacting standards. Victoria Blackwood explained the household rules with the precision of a military commander. Grace would arrive at 6 in the morning and work until 8 in the evening, 6 days a week. She would be responsible for all cleaning, laundry, meal preparation, and childcare when needed. She would use the servants' entrance at all times, never the front door that was reserved for family and guests. She would speak only when spoken to during family meals and social gatherings. She would wear the uniform provided and ensure it was always clean and pressed. Most importantly, she would remember her place in the household hierarchy and never forget that her job depended entirely on the Blackwood family's satisfaction. Grace agreed to everything because the salary Victoria offered was more than she had ever earned in her life. The Blackwood dynasty represented everything American society admired about success and respectability. Robert Blackwood came from old Connecticut money, the kind of generational wealth that traced its origins to early industrial fortunes. His family name appeared on hospital wings, university buildings, and cultural institutions throughout New England. Robert had followed the expected path of his social class, attending Yale University, joining the Wright fraternity, and entering the investment banking world, where family connections mattered more than talent. By 2004, he was managing hundreds of millions in assets and earning bonuses that exceeded most people's lifetime incomes. Victoria Blackwood had been born Victoria Ashford, daughter of a Connecticut state senator and a former beauty queen. She had spent her teens and early 20s working as a model, gracing the covers of regional magazines and appearing in advertisements for luxury brands. Her marriage to Robert in 1995 had been the social event of the season, covered extensively in society pages and attended by politicians, business leaders, and cultural elite. Victoria had embraced her role as a socialite wife with enthusiasm, organizing charity galas, serving on museum boards, and hosting political fundraisers that raised millions for causes she claimed to support. The Blackwood children completed the perfect family portrait that Victoria worked so hard to maintain. Madison was 16 in 2004, a sophomore at an exclusive private school known for sending graduates to Ivy League universities. She had inherited her mother's beauty and her father's sense of entitlement, already showing signs of the casual cruelty that seemed to run in the family. Chase was 14, athletic and popular, destined for the same private schools and social circles that had shaped his parents' lives. Both children had been raised by a succession of nannies and domestic workers, taught to view service staff as invisible fixtures rather than human beings deserving respect. The first incident occurred just 3 months after Grace began working for the Blackwood family. Victoria had been entertaining guests for a dinner party, and Grace was serving wine when she accidentally brushed against an expensive crystal vase. The vase wobbled but didn't fall, but Victoria's reaction was swift and disproportionate. In front of 8 dinner guests, Victoria grabbed Grace's wrist so tightly it left bruises and hissed that clumsy people didn't belong in civilized homes. She deducted 2 weeks' wages from Grace's pay for the near accident and made her work an additional 4 hours that evening, cleaning every piece of crystal in the house. Grace went home that night with aching hands and a sinking feeling that she might have made a terrible mistake. Grace's sister, Carmen, noticed the changes immediately. Grace had always been the family optimist, the one who saw possibilities where others saw problems, the one who called every Sunday with stories about her work and her children's achievements. But after 6 months at the Blackwood estate, those calls became shorter and less frequent. Grace stopped talking about her employers, deflecting questions about her workday with vague responses about being busy. Carmen noticed bruises on Grace's arms during family gatherings, marks that Grace explained away as accidents or clumsiness. When Carmen pressed for details about her work environment, Grace would change the subject or make excuses about needing to leave early. The warning signs were there for anyone willing to see them, but Grace had become expert at hiding the truth even from herself. She convinced herself that Victoria's behavior was just perfectionism, that wealthy people naturally had higher standards than she was used to meeting. She told herself that the verbal abuse was simply directness, that the physical aggression was accidental, that the systematic humiliation was just part of working for demanding employers. Grace needed to believe these lies because acknowledging the truth would mean admitting that she had trapped herself and her children in a situation that was slowly destroying her soul. But Grace needed this job more than she needed her dignity, or so she convinced herself during those early years. Maria was excelling in high school and dreaming of medical school, but those dreams required money that Grace had never possessed. James was showing exceptional aptitude in mathematics and science, talents that could lead to scholarships and opportunities beyond their family's modest means. Angela was thriving in her art classes, creating paintings and sculptures that suggested real artistic gifts worth nurturing. Grace calculated that if she could endure 5 years of work at the Blackwood estate, she could save enough money to change her children's lives forever. She had no idea that staying would cost her everything she had ever valued about herself. She had no idea that Victoria Blackwood viewed her not as an employee, but as a target for cruelty that would escalate with each passing year. The verbal attacks began subtly, disguised as constructive criticism and high standards. Victoria would inspect Grace's work with the intensity of a military commander, running her fingers along baseboards and examining windows for microscopic streaks. When she found imperfections, which she always did, Victoria would sigh dramatically and make comments about how some people simply lacked the breeding to understand quality. She would question whether Grace had ever seen real cleanliness before working for the Blackwood family, suggesting that perhaps people like Grace came from environments where standards were naturally lower. These comments were delivered with a smile and a tone that could be mistaken for patience, making Grace doubt whether she was overreacting to what might simply be employer feedback. As months turned into years, Victoria's language became more explicitly degrading. She began referring to Grace as "you people" when discussing domestic workers with her socialite friends, as if Grace were not standing right there serving their tea. During dinner parties, Victoria would tell stories about the challenges of training household staff, describing Grace's mistakes and shortcomings as entertainment for her guests. She would comment on Grace's appearance, her accent, her children's achievements or lack thereof, always with the implication that Grace should be grateful for the opportunity to work for a family of such distinction. These verbal assaults occurred daily, systematically chipping away at Grace's self-worth while maintaining the facade of employer-employee communication. The physical degradation escalated alongside the verbal abuse, but always in ways that Victoria could justify as necessary discipline or quality control. When Grace failed to remove a wine stain completely, Victoria made her scrub the entire carpet with a toothbrush, staying on her hands and knees for hours until the task was completed to Victoria's satisfaction. When Grace accidentally broke a dish, Victoria required her to hand wash every piece of china in the house, using only cold water and her bare hands, a process that left Grace's skin raw and bleeding. These punishments were presented as learning experiences, ways to help Grace develop the attention to detail that wealthy households required. Victoria's psychological warfare was perhaps the most devastating aspect of Grace's daily existence. She would change household rules without notice, then punish Grace for failing to follow the new protocols. She would hide valuable items and then accuse Grace of stealing them, threatening to call the police unless Grace accepted responsibility and additional unpaid work as penance. Victoria would praise Grace's work in front of her family, then immediately criticize the same tasks when they were alone, creating a constant state of confusion and anxiety. She would ask about Grace's children's activities and achievements, then use that information to make cutting remarks about their limitations and likely failures. The Christmas bonus incident of 2015 revealed the true depth of Victoria's cruelty. Grace had worked extra hours throughout December, preparing for multiple holiday parties and managing additional cleaning responsibilities as the Blackwood family entertained constantly during the season. Victoria had promised a substantial Christmas bonus, money that Grace desperately needed to help Maria with college application fees and prepare for her upcoming tuition payments. On Christmas Eve, Victoria presented Grace with an envelope, smiling as she wished her happy holidays. Inside was a $25 gift card to a discount store, along with a note suggesting that Grace use it to buy appropriate work clothes, since her current wardrobe was becoming unsuitable for a household of their caliber. Grace's silent suffering deepened with each passing year, but she convinced herself that endurance was her strength, and that sacrificing her dignity was a form of maternal love. Maria had been accepted to a prestigious pre-med program, but the tuition was astronomical. James had earned a partial scholarship to an excellent high school, but additional costs for books and supplies stretched Grace's budget to the breaking point. Angela was showing remarkable artistic talent, but private art lessons and supplies required money that Grace could only earn by staying at the Blackwood estate. Every insult Victoria delivered was an investment in her children's futures. Every moment of humiliation was temporary suffering that would lead to permanent change for the next generation. The isolation was as damaging as the abuse itself. Grace had initially maintained friendships with other domestic workers in the area, women who understood the challenges of working for demanding employers. But Victoria discovered these relationships and expressed concern about Grace discussing family business with outsiders. She began requiring Grace to work longer hours, making it impossible to maintain social connections. When Grace's friend Carmen called to check on her, Victoria would hover nearby, making it clear that personal phone calls during work hours were inappropriate. Gradually, Grace's support system disappeared, leaving her alone with Victoria's voice as her primary source of feedback about her worth as a human being. Grace began keeping a diary during her 5th year with the Blackwood family, writing in a small notebook that she hid in her purse. The entries reveal a woman trying to make sense of her daily reality while maintaining hope for her children's futures. Early entries focus on practical concerns about work schedules and household management, but as years pass, the diary becomes a record of systematic psychological destruction. Grace writes about Victoria's latest cruelties, then immediately follows with justifications about why the treatment might be deserved or necessary. She documents her own mistakes and failures with the obsessive detail of someone who has internalized their abuser's voice as their own internal critic. One particularly heartbreaking entry from 2012 reads, "Today, Victoria told me that Maria would never make it through medical school because people like us don't have the discipline for advanced education. She said I was setting my daughter up for failure by encouraging unrealistic dreams. Maybe she's right. Maybe I should tell Maria to choose something more practical, something that people from our background can actually achieve. But then I remember why I'm here, why I endure this every day. Maria is brilliant. She deserves every opportunity I can give her, even if it costs me everything." Victoria's drinking problem, which had always existed but remained relatively controlled, began escalating dramatically around 2016. Robert's business required increasingly frequent travel, leaving Victoria alone in the house with Grace for days at a time. Without the moderating influence of her husband's presence, Victoria's treatment of Grace became more erratic and violent. She would drink throughout the day, starting with mimosas at breakfast and progressing to wine and harder liquor as the hours passed. Alcohol amplified her cruelty, removing the thin veneer of civility that she maintained for public consumption. The incident with Grace's grandson in 2017 marked a turning point in their relationship. Grace had requested permission to bring her 5-year-old grandson to work for a few hours while his regular babysitter was unavailable. Victoria had initially agreed, but when the child accidentally spilled juice on a kitchen counter, her reaction was explosive. She screamed at the child, calling him names that no adult should ever direct at a child, then turned her fury on Grace. Victoria threatened to fire Grace immediately unless she accepted full responsibility for exposing the Blackwood home to the chaos that apparently characterized Grace's family life. She deducted a week's wages as punishment and forbade Grace from ever again bringing family members to the estate. The security cameras that would eventually capture Victoria's final mistake were installed in 2018, officially for home security, but actually for Victoria's entertainment. She had grown bored with simply abusing Grace in person and wanted the ability to review and relive her favorite moments of psychological torture. Victoria would spend hours watching footage of Grace's humiliation, sometimes inviting friends to join her in mocking the woman who cleaned their homes and cared for their children. The cameras captured everything: Victoria's verbal assaults, her physical attacks, her systematic campaign to destroy Grace's spirit and dignity. By early 2019, Grace Washington was no longer the hopeful woman who had driven from Detroit 15 years earlier. She was a shell of her former self, functioning on autopilot and surviving on the fumes of maternal determination. Maria had graduated medical school and was beginning her residency, an achievement that should have filled Grace with pride, but instead felt hollow after years of Victoria's predictions about her daughter's inevitable failure. James had earned a full scholarship to college and was studying engineering, another victory that Grace couldn't fully celebrate because Victoria's voice had become her own internal critic. Angela was thriving as an art student, but Grace could no longer appreciate her daughter's talents without hearing Victoria's comments about the impracticality of artistic careers. Grace had endured 15 years of systematic abuse because she believed it was temporary, because she convinced herself that her suffering had meaning and purpose. But by March 2019, all 3 of her children had achieved the success she had sacrificed everything to make possible. The justification for her endurance was complete, but the endurance itself had become a habit she no longer knew how to break. Grace Washington was trapped in a cycle of abuse that had outlived its original purpose, serving a woman who viewed her destruction as entertainment rather than employment. On March 15, 2019, Victoria Blackwood made a mistake that would cost her everything. She had grown so comfortable with her absolute power over Grace Washington that she forgot one crucial truth: every human being has a breaking point, and 15 years of systematic torture creates a force that cannot be contained forever. Victoria thought she understood Grace's limits because she had been testing them methodically for over a decade. She thought she knew exactly how much abuse Grace would accept before walking away. She was wrong. The stage was set for disaster before the evening even began. Robert Blackwood was in London on business, managing a merger that would add hundreds of millions to his portfolio. Madison was completing her junior year at a prestigious boarding school in Vermont, while Chase was finishing his sophomore year at an exclusive academy in New Hampshire. Victoria Blackwood was alone in the mansion with Grace Washington, a situation that had become increasingly dangerous as Victoria's alcoholism and sadistic tendencies fed off each other in Robert's absence. Grace had requested the evening off to attend her granddaughter's school play, but Victoria had refused, insisting that she needed help preparing for a dinner party she was hosting for 12 of Connecticut's most influential women. The dinner party was Victoria's attempt to secure her appointment to the board of directors for the state's largest children's charity, a position that would enhance her social standing and provide new opportunities for public recognition. She had spent weeks planning the menu, selecting wines, and arranging flowers throughout the house. Every detail had to be perfect, because the women attending this dinner controlled access to the most exclusive social circles in Connecticut. Victoria's reputation as a hostess was part of her identity, and any failure would be viewed as a personal humiliation that she could not afford. Grace arrived at the Blackwood estate at 4 in the afternoon to begin preparations for the evening's entertainment. She could immediately tell that Victoria had been drinking since lunch, a dangerous sign that usually preceded particularly violent episodes. Victoria's speech was slightly slurred as she reviewed the evening's schedule. Her movements were less controlled than usual, and her criticism of Grace's appearance was more vicious than normal. Victoria complained that Grace's uniform looked shabby, that her hair was inappropriate for such an important evening, and that her entire presence would embarrass the family if any of the guests noticed her. The dinner party began well enough with Victoria playing the perfect hostess, while Grace remained invisible in the background, serving courses and refilling wine glasses without speaking or making eye contact with the guests. Victoria was charming and articulate, discussing her philanthropic work and expressing her passion for helping disadvantaged children throughout Connecticut. She spoke eloquently about the importance of giving back to the community and the responsibility that came with privilege and wealth. The irony was lost on everyone except Grace, who had spent 15 years experiencing the reality behind Victoria's charitable facade. As the evening progressed and more wine was consumed, Victoria's control began slipping in subtle ways that her guests didn't notice, but Grace recognized immediately. Victoria's laughter became too loud, her gestures too dramatic, her comments about current events too pointed and personal. She began making subtle digs at other charitable organizations, questioning the effectiveness of their programs and the motivations of their leadership. By the time dessert was served, Victoria was clearly intoxicated, though still functional enough to maintain the appearance of sophisticated dinner conversation. The guests departed around 10:30, praising Victoria's hospitality and promising to support her charitable board application. Victoria's performance had been successful from a social perspective, but Grace knew that the combination of alcohol, stress, and adrenaline often led to Victoria's most violent episodes. As Grace began cleaning the dining room and kitchen, she moved carefully and quietly, hoping to complete her work and leave before Victoria's mood shifted from triumphant to destructive. She should have known that 15 years of experience with Victoria's patterns wouldn't be enough to predict what happened next. The confrontation began with a vintage wine stain on an antique Persian carpet that had been in Robert's family for 4 generations. One of the dinner guests had accidentally knocked over her glass while gesturing during a conversation about art collecting, but Victoria had handled the incident gracefully at the time, assuring her guest that accidents happen and that the stain could be easily removed. Grace had immediately blotted the spill and applied appropriate cleaning solutions, but the red wine had penetrated deep into the carpet's fibers, leaving a faint but visible mark that would require professional restoration. Victoria discovered the stain while conducting her post-party inspection of the house, a ritual she performed after every social gathering to ensure that everything met her standards. The wine stain sent her into an immediate rage that was disproportionate even by her usual standards. She screamed at Grace to explain how such carelessness could occur during such an important evening, demanding to know why Grace hadn't prevented the accident or cleaned it more effectively. Victoria's voice carried throughout the empty mansion, echoing off marble floors and crystal chandeliers, as she berated Grace for incompetence that she claimed had embarrassed the family in front of influential guests. Grace tried to explain that she had cleaned the stain immediately, and that professional carpet restoration would remove any remaining trace, but Victoria was beyond reason. The alcohol, the stress of the evening, and 15 years of accumulated contempt for Grace combined into a fury that demanded more than verbal abuse. Victoria began pushing Grace toward the stain, forcing her to kneel on the carpet while screaming that she would scrub it with her bare hands until every trace disappeared. Grace found herself on her hands and knees, attempting to clean a stain that had already been treated, while Victoria stood over her, delivering a stream of racial slurs and personal attacks that cut deeper than any physical blow. The verbal assault escalated beyond anything Grace had endured in 15 years of systematic abuse. Victoria called Grace names that questioned her intelligence, her competence, her worth as a human being, and her value to society. She made explicit references to Grace's race, suggesting that certain people lacked the breeding and education necessary to work in civilized households. Victoria threatened to call the police and report Grace for property damage, knowing that a criminal record would destroy any chance Grace had of finding other employment. She promised to contact every domestic employment agency in Connecticut to ensure that Grace would never work for another respectable family. But it was Victoria's attack on Grace's children that crossed the final line. Victoria began mocking Maria's medical career, suggesting that affirmative action had been responsible for her success and that she would inevitably fail when faced with real challenges. She questioned James's engineering abilities, implying that his scholarship had been charity rather than merit-based achievement. Most devastatingly, Victoria attacked Angela's artistic talents, calling them delusions and predicting that Grace's youngest daughter would end up as broken and worthless as her mother. These attacks on her children, the very people Grace had sacrificed everything to protect, finally shattered the last of her self-control. The final slap came without warning, delivered with 15 years of accumulated rage behind it. Victoria's hand connected with Grace's face with enough force to split her lip and send her sprawling backward into the coffee table. The sound echoed through the mansion like a gunshot, followed by the crash of Grace's body hitting furniture and the tinkle of breaking glass as a crystal ornament shattered on the floor. For a moment, both women were frozen in tableau. Victoria with her hand still raised, and Grace bleeding on the Persian carpet that had started everything. But something fundamental had changed in that moment of violence. Grace Washington looked up at Victoria Blackwood and felt something she hadn't experienced in 15 years: clarity. The fog of justification, endurance, and self-sacrifice lifted, leaving behind a woman who suddenly understood that she didn't have to accept this treatment anymore. Her children were grown, their futures secure, her purpose as their protector complete. She no longer needed to sacrifice her dignity for their dreams, because their dreams had already been achieved. Grace slowly stood up, wiping blood from her mouth, and said the words that would change everything. No more. What happened in the next 7 minutes was captured by Victoria's security cameras, the same system she had installed to record Grace's humiliation for her own entertainment. The footage shows Grace Washington rising from the floor with a calm determination that Victoria had never seen before. It shows Victoria backing away, suddenly uncertain in the face of Grace's transformed demeanor. It shows a conversation between the two women that lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, though the audio was damaged and investigators were never able to determine what was said. It shows Victoria Blackwood falling backward, striking her head on the marble fireplace hearth and lying motionless on the floor while Grace Washington stood over her. The security footage reveals that Grace made no attempt to flee after Victoria fell. Instead, she called 911 immediately, requesting both police and paramedics for a woman who had been injured in an accident. She provided the Blackwood estate address clearly and calmly, answered the dispatcher's questions with precision, and remained on the line until emergency services arrived. Grace then sat in the kitchen, still wearing her blood-stained uniform, and waited for the authorities to take her into custody. When the police arrived at 9:47 p.m., they found Grace Washington exactly where she said she would be, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded in her lap. Officer Michael Rodriguez later testified that Grace seemed eerily calm, almost relieved, as if a tremendous burden had been lifted from her shoulders. When asked what had happened, Grace looked directly at Rodriguez and gave a statement that would define the entire case. "I just wanted it to stop." She offered no resistance when they placed her in handcuffs, asked no questions about her rights or legal representation, and showed no emotion when the paramedics covered Victoria Blackwood's unconscious form and loaded her into an ambulance. But what Grace didn't know was that the security system had been recording everything, and what it captured would shock even the investigating detectives. The cameras had documented not just the events of March 15th, but 15 years of systematic abuse that transformed a simple assault case into something far more complex. Hidden in Victoria's private files, investigators would discover hundreds of hours of recorded torture, evidence of wage theft totaling over $200,000, and documentation of a systematic campaign of psychological destruction that Victoria had orchestrated for her own twisted entertainment. The woman who had installed cameras to record her victims' humiliation had instead created the evidence that would expose her own crimes and transform Grace Washington from perpetrator to survivor. The initial news reports painted a picture that was both predictable and devastating for Grace Washington. Local television stations led with headlines like "Domestic Worker Attacks, Wealthy Employer," and "Violence Erupts at Connecticut Estate," framing the incident as another example of workplace violence that had unfortunately become common in American society. The early reporting focused on the Blackwood family's prominence in Connecticut society, their charitable work, and their contributions to local cultural institutions. Grace Washington was described simply as a 52-year-old domestic worker who had been employed by the family for 15 years before the violent incident that left Victoria Blackwood hospitalized with severe head trauma. The narrative that emerged in those first 48 hours played directly into existing stereotypes and social tensions. Conservative media outlets used the story to discuss the risks that wealthy families faced when employing domestic workers, suggesting that background checks and security measures were insufficient protection against violent employees. Liberal commentators focused on the economic desperation that might drive domestic workers to violence, discussing wage theft and poor working conditions without yet understanding the full scope of what Grace Washington had endured. Social media exploded with opinions from people who knew nothing about the real situation, but felt qualified to judge both women based on limited information and their own prejudices. The racial dynamics of the case became immediately apparent as the story gained national attention. Grace Washington, a black domestic worker, had allegedly attacked Victoria Blackwood, a white socialite known for her charitable work with disadvantaged children. The optics were terrible for Grace, fitting perfectly into historical narratives about dangerous black women who posed threats to innocent white families. Twitter erupted with hashtags supporting both sides, with Charm Justice for Grace competing against Trachu's Stand with Victoria, as people chose sides based on incomplete information and their own political leanings rather than facts that had not yet been revealed. Celebrity involvement amplified the controversy beyond anything a local assault case would normally generate. Several prominent actresses and musicians who had worked with domestic workers in their own homes expressed support for Victoria Blackwood, discussing the trust and vulnerability involved in allowing someone into your private space. Conversely, civil rights activists and organizations focused on labor issues rallied behind Grace Washington, though they were working with limited information about what had actually occurred in the Blackwood mansion. The case became a proxy war for larger discussions about race, class, and power in American society, with Grace Washington and Victoria Blackwood serving as symbols rather than real people whose lives had been forever changed by 15 years of systematic abuse. Detective Maria Santos was assigned to investigate the case, partly because of her experience with domestic violence cases, and partly because the police department wanted a Latina detective handling a case with obvious racial implications. Santos had spent 12 years working domestic violence cases and understood that initial appearances often concealed more complex truths about power, control, and systematic abuse. When she arrived at the Blackwood estate on the morning of March 16th to examine the crime scene, Santos immediately noticed details that didn't match the simple assault narrative being promoted in media reports. The first inconsistency was Grace Washington's behavior during and after the incident. Santos had interviewed hundreds of domestic violence perpetrators, and Grace's calm demeanor, immediate cooperation, and apparent relief were completely unlike typical patterns of behavior following violent confrontations. Most perpetrators of domestic violence showed signs of agitation, defensiveness, or remorse, but Grace seemed almost peaceful, as if she had finally resolved a long-standing problem. Santos also noted that Grace had made no attempt to flee, had called for medical help immediately, and had waited calmly for police to arrive, behavior that suggested someone who felt justified in her actions rather than someone who had committed a crime of passion. The second inconsistency was the extensive security system throughout the Blackwood estate. Santos discovered cameras in every room of the house, recording devices that captured both audio and video 24 hours a day, and digital storage systems that maintained months of recorded material. The official explanation was home security, but the camera placement seemed designed to monitor household activities rather than prevent external threats. Santos requested access to all security footage from March 15th, expecting to find clear evidence of the assault that would support criminal charges against Grace Washington. Instead, she discovered something that would fundamentally change her understanding of the entire case. The security footage from March 15th told a story that was completely different from initial police reports and media coverage. The cameras captured Victoria Blackwood's verbal assault on Grace Washington, her physical aggression, and the escalating violence that led to the final confrontation. Santos watched in horror as 15 years of systematic abuse played out in real time, recorded by the very woman who was inflicting it. The footage showed Victoria forcing Grace to scrub carpet stains with her bare hands, screaming racial slurs, and delivering the final slap that split Grace's lip and triggered the confrontation that left Victoria unconscious on the marble floor. But the March 15th footage was just the beginning of Detective Santos's discoveries. Hidden in Victoria Blackwood's private office were external hard drives containing hundreds of hours of recorded abuse, spanning the entire 15 years of Grace Washington's employment. Victoria had been systematically documenting her torture of Grace Washington, not as evidence of wrongdoing, but as personal entertainment that she could review at her leisure. Santos found recordings of Victoria forcing Grace to clean with toothbrushes, subjecting her to hours of verbal abuse, and inflicting psychological torture that would have broken most people within months rather than years. The recordings revealed patterns of abuse that Santos had never encountered in her 12 years of domestic violence investigation. Victoria Blackwood had created elaborate scenarios designed to humiliate Grace Washington, setting up situations where Grace would inevitably fail and then punishing her for those failures. She had recorded herself reviewing these torture sessions, sometimes with friends who found Grace's suffering amusing. Victoria had developed a systematic approach to psychological destruction that demonstrated planning, creativity, and a level of cruelty that went far beyond typical domestic violence patterns. Other domestic workers began coming forward as news of the investigation spread throughout Connecticut's domestic employment networks. Santos interviewed 7 women who had previously worked for the Blackwood family, all of whom had quit suddenly after brief periods of employment. Their testimonies revealed that Grace Washington's experience was not unique, but rather the most extreme example of Victoria Blackwood's treatment of household staff. Previous domestic workers described verbal abuse, wage theft, impossible working conditions, and psychological manipulation that had driven them to seek other employment, despite desperate financial situations. Maria Santos's investigation uncovered evidence of wage theft totaling over $200,000 across Grace Washington's 15 years of employment. Victoria Blackwood had systematically deducted money from Grace's wages for minor infractions, imaginary damage to household items, and punishments that had no basis in their employment agreement. She had forced Grace to work unpaid overtime, denied her legally mandated breaks, and withheld holiday bonuses that had been promised as part of her compensation package. The financial abuse was as systematic and deliberate as the psychological torture, designed to keep Grace trapped in the employment relationship by making it financially impossible for her to leave. The investigation also revealed medical records that Grace Washington had tried to hide throughout her 15 years of employment with the Blackwood family. Hospital visits for injuries that Grace had explained as accidents or clumsiness, medical treatments for stress-related conditions that she had paid for herself rather than risk questions from insurance companies, and prescription medications for anxiety and depression that Grace had obtained from doctors who didn't understand the source of her psychological trauma. The medical evidence painted a picture of a woman whose physical and mental health had been systematically destroyed by years of abuse that she had hidden from everyone who might have been able to help her. Detective Santos discovered Victoria Blackwood's private journal hidden in a safe behind a painting in her bedroom. The journal entries revealed the depth of Victoria's psychological pathology and her deliberate plan to destroy Grace Washington's spirit and dignity. Victoria wrote extensively about her enjoyment of inflicting pain, her satisfaction in watching Grace accept increasingly severe abuse, and her long-term goal of completely breaking her domestic worker's will to resist. The journal contained detailed descriptions of psychological manipulation techniques, plans for escalating abuse, and Victoria's analysis of Grace's responses to various forms of torture. One particularly disturbing journal entry from 2018 reads, "Grace is almost completely broken now. She accepts whatever I do to her without resistance, which is satisfying but also boring. I need to find new ways to make her suffer, perhaps involving her family more directly. Her grandson's visit gave me some interesting ideas about leverage points I haven't fully exploited. I think the key is making her believe that her endurance protects her children, when in reality I could destroy them anytime I choose. The psychological control is so much more satisfying than simple physical abuse." The security footage didn't just show what happened that night. It revealed 15 years of systematic torture that Victoria Blackwood had been documenting for her own twisted pleasure. Detective Santos realized that she was investigating not a simple assault case, but one of the most extreme examples of domestic servitude and psychological abuse in modern American history. Grace Washington hadn't committed a crime. She had finally defended herself against a systematic campaign of torture that had been carefully planned and executed by a woman who viewed human suffering as entertainment. The evidence was overwhelming, disturbing, and completely contrary to every initial assumption about the case that had captured national attention. The trial of Grace Washington began on October 14, 2019, 7 months after the incident that had transformed her from invisible domestic worker to the center of a national controversy about race, class, and justice in America. The Stamford Superior Courthouse was surrounded by protesters from both sides, with civil rights activists demanding justice for Grace Washington, while conservative groups called for law and order and respect for property rights. Media trucks lined the streets, satellite dishes reached toward the sky, and reporters from national networks provided live coverage of what had become one of the most closely watched criminal trials in Connecticut history. The prosecution's case seemed straightforward and overwhelming at first glance. Assistant District Attorney Robert Chen presented evidence that Grace Washington had been present at the scene when Victoria Blackwood sustained life-threatening head injuries, that Grace had admitted to wanting the violence to stop, and that she had made no attempt to provide medical assistance before calling emergency services. Chen argued that regardless of any prior employment disputes or personality conflicts, Grace Washington had crossed the line from victim to perpetrator when she chose violence over walking away from her job. The prosecution's narrative was simple. Employees who are unhappy with their working conditions should seek other employment, not resort to assault and battery against their employers. Chen's opening statement focused on the rule of law and the principle that personal grievances, no matter how legitimate, could never justify violence against another human being. He acknowledged that Grace Washington might have experienced difficult working conditions, but he argued that millions of Americans work in challenging environments without resorting to criminal behavior. Chen presented Victoria Blackwood as an unconscious victim who might never fully recover from her traumatic brain injury, a woman who had dedicated her life to charitable work and community service, only to be brutally attacked by someone she had trusted in her home for 15 years. The defense strategy, led by attorney Sarah Martinez, was far more complex and required the jury to understand 15 years of systematic psychological torture that had been invisible to everyone outside the Blackwood estate. Martinez's opening statement painted Grace Washington as a survivor of domestic servitude who had endured abuse that would have broken most people within months rather than years. She promised to present evidence that would shock the jury and demonstrate that Grace Washington had acted in self-defense after 15 years of escalating violence and psychological torture that had been carefully documented by her abuser. Martinez faced the challenge of explaining to 12 jurors, most of whom had never experienced anything approaching Grace Washington's situation, how systematic psychological abuse could create circumstances where self-defense became necessary for survival. She had to help them understand that Grace Washington hadn't chosen violence, but had been forced into a corner where violence was the only option left for protecting her basic human dignity. Martinez's strategy required transforming Grace from perpetrator to survivor in the minds of jurors who had been conditioned by media coverage to view her as a dangerous domestic worker who had attacked her generous employer. Grace Washington's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the defense case, but it required her to relive 15 years of systematic abuse in front of a packed courtroom, television cameras, and a national audience that was deeply divided about her guilt or innocence. Martinez had spent months preparing Grace for this moment, helping her organize her thoughts and emotions so she could present her story coherently despite the trauma she had endured. Grace wore a simple blue dress, spoke in a clear voice, and maintained eye contact with the jury as she described her daily reality in the Blackwood estate. Grace began her testimony by explaining why she had initially accepted employment with the Blackwood family and why she had stayed for 15 years despite escalating abuse. She described her children's achievements, their college educations, and their current success as doctors, engineers, and artists, making it clear that her sacrifice had been motivated by maternal love rather than personal weakness. Grace explained that she had convinced herself that enduring Victoria Blackwood's treatment was temporary, that her suffering had meaning and purpose, and that walking away would have meant abandoning her children's dreams for her own comfort. The courtroom fell silent as Grace described the daily reality of working for Victoria Blackwood. She testified about being forced to clean carpets with toothbrushes, about washing dishes in cold water until her hands bled, about listening to racial slurs and personal attacks that were designed to destroy her self-worth. Grace spoke about the isolation that prevented her from maintaining friendships or seeking help, about the financial control that made leaving impossible, and about the psychological manipulation that convinced her that the abuse was somehow deserved or necessary. Grace's voice broke only once during her testimony, when she described Victoria Blackwood's attacks on her children's achievements and potential. She explained that she could endure personal humiliation and physical pain, but that hearing her children described as failures and frauds had finally pushed her beyond her capacity for endurance. Grace testified that on March 15, 2019, when Victoria delivered that final slap and continued her verbal assault, something fundamental changed inside her. For the first time in 15 years, Grace Washington had said no more, and meant it. The cross-examination by Prosecutor Chen was brutal and designed to undermine Grace's credibility by focusing on her actions during the final confrontation rather than the 15 years of abuse that preceded it. Chen questioned why Grace hadn't simply walked away from her job if the working conditions were as bad as she claimed. He suggested that Grace had become comfortable with her high salary and free housing arrangement and had chosen violence when her employment was threatened. Chen implied that Grace's testimony was a carefully constructed story designed to justify criminal behavior and evade responsibility for her actions. But Chen's aggressive cross-examination strategy backfired when Grace responded to his questions with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout her ordeal with Victoria Blackwood. When Chen asked why she hadn't sought help from police or social services, Grace explained that domestic workers often face skepticism when reporting abuse by wealthy employers, especially when those employers are prominent community members known for charitable work. When Chen questioned her decision to stay in an allegedly abusive situation for 15 years, Grace looked directly at him and said, "I just wanted to go home to my grandchildren without wondering how I would pay for their school clothes or their medical care. Sometimes survival requires endurance that other people might not understand." Victoria Blackwood's testimony was supposed to be the prosecution's strongest evidence against Grace Washington, but it became a disaster that fundamentally changed the trajectory of the entire trial. Victoria had spent 8 months recovering from her traumatic brain injury, and while she had regained most of her cognitive abilities, the stress of testifying about the incident triggered an emotional breakdown that revealed the depth of her psychological pathology. Defense attorney Martinez had prepared extensively for Victoria's testimony, armed with hundreds of hours of security footage that documented her systematic abuse of Grace Washington. Victoria's breakdown began when Martinez confronted her with recordings of her own voice screaming racial slurs at Grace Washington. As the courtroom listened to audio of Victoria forcing Grace to scrub floors with her bare hands while calling her degrading names, Victoria began sobbing and claiming that the recordings had been taken out of context or edited to make her seem worse than she actually was. But Martinez had video evidence that clearly showed the context of Victoria's abuse, leaving no room for alternative explanations or justifications. The most damaging moment of Victoria's testimony came when Martinez presented evidence from Victoria's private journal describing her enjoyment of inflicting psychological torture on Grace Washington. Victoria attempted to deny that the journal entries reflected her true feelings, claiming that she had been going through a difficult period in her marriage and had written things she didn't mean. But when Martinez read aloud Victoria's detailed plans for escalating abuse and her analysis of Grace's psychological responses to various forms of torture, Victoria's credibility collapsed completely. The jury watched in horror as the woman they had initially viewed as a victim revealed herself to be a calculating abuser who had systematically destroyed another human being's dignity for her own entertainment. The bombshell evidence that sealed Victoria Blackwood's fate and guaranteed Grace Washington's acquittal came in the form of recordings that Victoria herself had made planning future violence against Grace. Hidden in Victoria's computer files, investigators had discovered audio recordings of Victoria discussing with friends how she might escalate her abuse of Grace Washington to see how much torture she could endure before breaking completely. These recordings, made just weeks before the March 15th incident, demonstrated that Victoria had been planning to increase her violence against Grace and had viewed the entire situation as a psychological experiment rather than an employment relationship. The financial records presented during the trial revealed systematic wage theft totaling over $200,000, money that Victoria had stolen from Grace Washington through false deductions, unpaid overtime, and withheld bonuses that had been promised as part of her employment agreement. Martinez demonstrated that Victoria had deliberately kept Grace in financial desperation to prevent her from leaving, using money as another tool of control and manipulation. The wage theft evidence transformed the case from a simple assault to a pattern of labor exploitation that had trapped Grace in an abusive situation through economic coercion. Medical examiner Dr. Patricia Williams testified about evidence of long-term physical abuse that Grace Washington had hidden throughout her 15 years of employment with the Blackwood family. X-rays revealed healed fractures that Grace had never reported, medical records documented injuries that she had explained as accidents, and photographs showed scarring consistent with repeated physical trauma. Dr. Williams explained that Grace's medical history was typical of domestic abuse survivors who hide their injuries to protect their employment and avoid questions that might threaten their economic stability. The testimony of other domestic workers who had previously worked for the Blackwood family provided crucial corroboration for Grace Washington's account of systematic abuse. 7 women testified about their experiences with Victoria Blackwood, describing verbal abuse, physical violence, wage theft, and psychological manipulation that had driven them to quit suddenly despite desperate financial circumstances. Their testimonies revealed that Grace Washington's experience was not unique, but rather the most extreme example of Victoria Blackwood's treatment of household staff, demonstrating a pattern of behavior that had persisted for over 2 decades. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning with a verdict that shocked prosecutors and vindicated Grace Washington after months of public vilification. The foreman announced not guilty verdicts on all charges of assault and battery, stating that the jury had found Grace Washington's actions to be justified self-defense after 15 years of systematic abuse and psychological torture. Several jurors were crying as they delivered the verdict, and Grace Washington collapsed in her chair, overwhelmed by emotions she had suppressed for over a decade. Grace's first words after the verdict were delivered through tears that seemed to wash away 15 years of accumulated pain and humiliation. She looked directly at the cameras and said, "I can finally breathe. I can finally go home to my grandchildren without carrying the weight of someone else's hatred. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to be treated like a human being." The courtroom erupted in applause from supporters who had followed the case, while Grace Washington sat quietly, finally free from the legal and psychological prison that had defined her life since 2004. But the verdict in Grace Washington's criminal trial was only the beginning of a legal reckoning that would destroy the Blackwood family's reputation and financial security. Prosecutors immediately filed countercharges against Victoria Blackwood, including multiple counts of assault, battery, wage theft, human trafficking, and psychological torture under Connecticut's expanded domestic violence statutes. The evidence that had exonerated Grace Washington became the foundation for criminal charges that could send Victoria Blackwood to prison for decades, transforming her from victim to defendant in a matter of hours. But this story doesn't end in the courtroom. What happened next would prove that sometimes justice comes in ways no one expects, and that the consequences of 15 years of systematic abuse extend far beyond criminal convictions or civil settlements. The trial had exposed the hidden world of domestic servitude in wealthy American households, but the real reckoning was just beginning for everyone who had enabled, ignored, or benefited from Grace Washington's suffering. 6 months after Grace Washington walked out of the Stamford Superior Courthouse a free woman, her life had transformed in ways that 15 years of abuse had made impossible to imagine. The legal victory had been just the beginning of a journey toward reclaiming her identity, her dignity, and her future. Grace had moved out of the small Stamford apartment where she had lived since 2004, using money from the civil settlement to purchase a modest house in a quiet neighborhood where her grandchildren could visit without fear or shame. For the first time in over a decade, Grace Washington was living without the constant anxiety that had defined her existence as Victoria Blackwood's domestic worker. Grace's new life centered around advocacy work that had emerged naturally from her experience and the national attention her case had generated. She began speaking at conferences about domestic worker rights, testifying before state legislatures about the need for stronger protections against abuse and exploitation. Grace's testimony was powerful because it came from lived experience rather than academic theory, and her quiet dignity in describing 15 years of systematic torture moved lawmakers who had never considered the vulnerability of domestic workers in wealthy households. Speaking engagements provided Grace with income that allowed her to choose her work based on meaning rather than desperation for the first time in her adult life. The civil lawsuit against the Blackwood family had resulted in a settlement of $1.2 million, money that represented not just compensation for Grace's suffering, but acknowledgement that her 15 years of abuse had real value and consequences. Grace used the settlement money wisely, paying off her children's remaining student loan debts, establishing college funds for her grandchildren, and purchasing the house that represented security and independence she had never believed possible. Most importantly, the settlement meant that Grace would never again be forced to accept abuse for economic survival, freeing her to make choices based on dignity rather than desperation. Maria Washington had completed her medical residency and was working as a pediatrician at a children's hospital in Hartford, finally achieving the dream that had motivated her mother's 15 years of sacrifice. Maria often spoke publicly about her mother's courage and the price that had been paid for her education, using her platform as a successful doctor to advocate for domestic worker protections and immigrant rights. James had graduated with his engineering degree and was working for a renewable energy company, developing solar power systems that would provide clean electricity to underserved communities. Angela had received a full scholarship to art school and was pursuing her master's degree in fine arts, creating sculptures and paintings that explored themes of resilience and survival. The transformation in Grace's relationship with her children was perhaps the most healing aspect of her new life. For 15 years, Grace had hidden the extent of her suffering to protect her children from worry and guilt about the price she was paying for their opportunities. Now, for the first time, Grace could be honest about her experiences, allowing her children to understand the depth of her sacrifice and to support her healing process. The family gatherings that had once been shadowed by Grace's exhaustion and hidden pain became celebrations of survival, achievement, and the unbreakable bonds that had sustained them through the darkest period of their lives. Victoria Blackwood's conviction and sentencing represented a form of justice that few domestic abuse survivors ever experience. After a separate criminal trial that lasted 3 weeks, Victoria was found guilty on multiple counts of assault, battery, wage theft, human trafficking, and psychological torture under Connecticut's expanded domestic violence statutes. The judge sentenced Victoria to 8 years in prison, noting that her systematic abuse of Grace Washington represented one of the most extreme cases of domestic servitude in modern American legal history. Victoria's conviction sent a message to wealthy families throughout Connecticut and beyond that domestic workers had legal rights that could not be violated with impunity. The Blackwood estate, once a symbol of generational wealth and social status, was sold to pay restitution to Grace Washington and other victims of the family's abuse. The $10 million property was purchased by a non-profit organization that converted it into a residential facility for domestic abuse survivors, ensuring that the house where Grace had suffered for 15 years would now serve as a place of healing and recovery for other women escaping similar situations. The irony was not lost on Grace, who attended the facility's opening ceremony and planted a garden where Victoria's prized rose bushes had once grown. Robert Blackwood, who had claimed ignorance of his wife's treatment of household staff, faced his own consequences as the investigation revealed his complicity in the systematic abuse. Financial records showed that Robert had been aware of the wage theft and had benefited from the unpaid labor that his wife had extracted through psychological torture. Robert's investment banking career ended in disgrace as clients withdrew their accounts and colleagues distanced themselves from association with the Blackwood name. The family's social connections, built over generations of charitable giving and community involvement, dissolved as former friends recognized their own moral failure in enabling and ignoring obvious signs of abuse. The deeper truth that emerged from Grace Washington's case was that her experience was not unique, but rather representative of a hidden epidemic of abuse in wealthy households across Connecticut and throughout the United States. The investigation that began with Grace's case expanded to examine domestic worker treatment in elite communities, revealing patterns of exploitation that had existed for decades without legal consequences or public attention. Detective Maria Santos, who had initially investigated Grace's case, became the head of a task force examining domestic worker abuse in wealthy households throughout the state. 23 other domestic workers came forward with stories of abuse, exploitation, and systematic mistreatment by wealthy employers who viewed household staff as less than human. These women, mostly immigrants from Latin America, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa, had suffered in silence for years because they lacked legal status, English proficiency, or social connections that would have enabled them to seek help. Grace Washington's courage in fighting back had created a safe space for other victims to speak out, leading to criminal charges against 12 other prominent Connecticut families and civil lawsuits that would ultimately cost millions in settlements and restitution. The legislative response to Grace Washington's case came in the form of comprehensive domestic worker protection legislation that was nicknamed Grace's Law by the media and advocacy organizations. The law established specific rights for domestic workers, including minimum wage protections, mandatory rest periods, overtime compensation, and legal remedies for abuse and exploitation. Most importantly, Grace's Law created a state agency specifically tasked with investigating complaints of domestic worker abuse and providing legal support for victims who might otherwise lack resources to protect themselves. Grace Washington personally testified in favor of the legislation, standing before the Connecticut state legislature and describing her 15 years of abuse in terms that lawmakers could understand and relate to. She explained that domestic workers were not seeking special treatment, but simply the same basic human rights that other employees took for granted: the right to be treated with dignity, the right to fair compensation for their labor, and the right to work without fear of violence or psychological torture. Grace's testimony was instrumental in securing unanimous passage of the legislation, making Connecticut the first state to establish comprehensive protections specifically designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse she had endured. The hidden epidemic of abuse in elite households that Grace's case revealed challenged comfortable assumptions about wealth, status, and moral character that many Americans preferred not to examine too closely. The investigation showed that charitable giving and community involvement could coexist with systematic cruelty toward vulnerable workers, that public respectability could mask private monstrosity, and that social class provided protection for abusers while leaving victims without recourse or support. Grace Washington's case forced a national conversation about the treatment of domestic workers and the responsibility that wealthy families bear for the vulnerable people they employ. Grace Washington endured 15 years of humiliation because she believed she had no choice, because she convinced herself that her suffering was temporary and meaningful, and because she prioritized her children's future over her own dignity and well-being. But sometimes, when we're pushed to our absolute limit, we discover reserves of strength and courage that we never knew existed. Sometimes the very experiences that seem to break us actually prepare us for the moment when we must choose between continued survival and reclaimed humanity. Grace Washington chose humanity, and in doing so, she changed not just her own life, but the lives of countless other domestic workers who'd been suffering in silence. The final twist in Grace Washington's story is that the slap that seemed to mark her lowest point actually marked the beginning of her liberation. That moment of violence, delivered by a woman who had tortured her for 15 years, finally gave Grace permission to stop accepting unacceptable treatment. Victoria Blackwood's final act of cruelty became the catalyst for Grace's transformation from victim to survivor to advocate, proving that even the most devastating experiences can become sources of strength and purpose when channeled toward justice and healing. Grace Washington now lives in a house filled with photographs of her children and grandchildren, awards recognizing her advocacy work, and letters from domestic workers across the country who have found courage in her example. She wakes up each morning without fear, speaks her mind without permission, and goes to sleep each night knowing that her suffering was not meaningless because it led to protection and justice for others who might otherwise have endured similar abuse. That final slap didn't break Grace Washington. It set her free, and in freeing herself, she helped free countless others who had been trapped in similar situation. What would you have done in Grace's position? Could you have endured 15 years of systematic abuse for your children's future? Would you have recognized the signs of escalating danger? Or would you have convinced yourself that endurance was strength? Let us know in the comments below what you think about Grace Washington's story and how it has changed your understanding of domestic worker rights and the hidden world of abuse in wealthy households. And if this story moved you, subscribe for more untold stories of courage against impossible odds, stories of ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when faced with circumstances that would have broken most of us.